Thank you so much for attending the mini lecture today on organizational commitment. What I'm going to do is introduce you to the three types of commitment and then give you some more detail about how each of these types of commitment are predicted or influenced in organizations. So really the first thing on our agenda is just to describe the three different types of organizational commitment that an employee can experience. So the first is called affective commitment. And affective commitment essentially means that an employee is staying at their organization because they want to. They enjoy being there and they have an emotional connection to the workplace. On the other hand, continuance commitment occurs when an employee stays because they need to. So whether an employee lacks other options or needs the paycheck for some reason or another, the employee feels like they have no other option but to stay with their organization. And then the last type of commitment is called normative commitment. And with normative commitment, this occurs when an employee stays because they ought to. In other words, they feel like it's the right thing to do, or they're staying because of moral reasons. So on the next slides that follow, we're going to dive into each one of these types of commitment in more detail. So we're going to start with affective commitment. So again, affective commitment occurs when an employee feels an emotional connection to their organization, and because of that emotional connection, they enjoy working there, and that causes them to want to stay. So employees that have affective commitment are going to identify with the organization. Perhaps they like the organization's values or they like the organization's mission. For whatever reason, they internalize those values of the organization as their own. So these individuals are going to accept the organization's values. They're going to feel as though they're really part of the organization. And oftentimes, being an employee at that organization is going to be really important for the employee's identity and self-concept. So employees that have affective commitment are going to be willing to exert effort on behalf of the organization. So these individuals are going to be more likely to work hard to complete their job responsibilities. They're also going to be more likely to engage in some of those citizenship behaviors, which, remember, citizenship behaviors help the organization even though they're not necessarily required. So these individuals are going to go above and beyond because they like the organization in which they're employed. So when we talk about different types of commitment, affective commitment really represents the group of employees that we want to have in our organizations. We want employees that like the organization. We want employees that like our values and our mission and want to put forth efforts towards our goals, right? So these are the kinds of employees that we're trying to create, that we're trying to hire. So affective commitment has been shown to affect the organization in a couple of ways that are really important. So these results are going to be based on a meta-analysis that was conducted back in the early 2000s. So remember, a meta-analysis is when we collect a whole bunch of studies on one topic and then find the average correlation. So what this study told us is that affective commitment is positively related to citizenship behaviors. So when employees like their organization, they're going to be more likely to engage in those good extra behaviors. It's also positively related to task performance. So employees that feel this emotional connection to the workplace are going to be more likely to complete their job duties. It's also negatively related to turnover, and that kind of makes sense. As employees enjoy being in the workplace, as their affective commitment goes up, their desire to leave the organization goes down. And similarly with absenteeism, as employees identify with the organization, as they feel an emotional connection to the organization, they're going to be less likely to be absent from the workplace. So if we want to know what it is that drives affective commitment to organizations, we can really focus on one factor, and that factor are social networks. So in order to create this bond with an organization, we need to focus on the social connections that employees create in the workplace. So essentially, the stronger, more positive social connections that an employee has, the more likely they're to feel that emotional connection to the organization as a whole. So when we talk about a social network, this diagram actually comes straight from the textbook, and you can see that these are different employees and there are connections between employees, and the lines kind of represent how strong those connections are, and it indicates how many connections a person has. So if we look at in the center of the screen, there's a blue employee, and they have 5 different connections, and 2 of those connections are quite strong. Whereas if we look at the leftmost blue employee, that employee only has 1 connection, and it's not very strong because the line is not very dark. So these social network diagrams can kind of help us to see how many connections do employees have and how strongly are they tied to other individuals, how close knit of a relationship have they formed with other people in the workplace. So what these social networks tell us is that the quality of relationships is going to impact employees and their desire to stay. So the first theory that's related to social networks is called the erosion model. And the erosion model basically says that people who have fewer social bonds at work are going to feel less emotionally connected. So if there's an employee that has no friends, that really isn't part of the in-group, that's excluded by other people, they're not going to feel emotionally connected to the workplace, and as a result, they're going to be much more likely to leave. The second model related to social networks is called the social influence model. And the social influence model basically says that leaving the organization becomes contagious over time. So when somebody has a lot of connections, when they're a central figure in the organization, if that person leaves, then it's going to be likely that other people who were in that person's social network, they're also going to leave. So if we go back to that diagram from the textbook, we had that key central figure who had multiple connections, multiple strong connections. If that person were to leave, it could influence other employees then to also leave the workplace. So again, when we're talking about affective commitment, we're talking about employees' social networks with other people. So if we want to create affective commitment, we do that by giving our employees opportunities to build bonds with other people. We could do this by having happy hours, by creating mentoring programs, by giving employees chances to just interact, maybe offering team-based work instead of individual assignments, because the more social connections an individual has, the more likely they're going to want to stay with that organization. So again, the erosion model just says if we don't have a lot of connections, we're going to leave. And the social influence model says if somebody has a lot of connection and they leave, that's going to then encourage other people to leave the organization later on as well. The second type of commitment is called continuance commitment. And again, this occurs when an employee stays with the organization but feels as though they have to stay. So in this instance, an employee is going to evaluate the costs of leaving and basically make a judgment about whether or not they can afford to leave the organization. So employees that have continuance commitment basically have an investment in the organization. So perhaps they've invested a lot of time, perhaps they've invested a lot in their retirement account, perhaps they're just received some kind of new responsibility. In any instance, these individuals have some kind of investment in the organization, and it makes it too costly for them to leave. Individuals might also have continuance commitment if there are a lack of employment alternatives. So right now, you might know we're in an economic downturn and there's not a lot of new employers hiring. In fact, unemployment is quite high. So employees who are in their jobs right now might not like their jobs, but might not have other opportunities to explore, and as a result they stay because they feel like they have to, not necessarily because they want to. We would consider continuance commitment a form of passive loyalty, which means, yes, these individuals are staying at work, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best kind of employees. And in fact, we'll see that continuance commitment doesn't necessarily predict some of those other outcomes that we might value in the organization. One key thing to take away from continuance commitment is that this is going to be the type of commitment that takes into account both work and non-work factors. So when an employee is evaluating the costs of leaving, they're going to consider professional but also personal costs that they might experience if they were to leave their job. So when it comes to looking at those meta-analyses results, what we found is that continuance commitment really doesn't affect the organization in a positive way. So there's actually no relationship with citizenship behaviors. What that means is an employee that has high level of continuance commitment, basically that doesn't influence their citizenship behaviors at all. It's also negatively related to turnover intentions. So as continuance commitment goes up, desires or intentions to leave the organization go down. So again, these individuals aren't necessarily planning on leaving, but they're staying because they feel as though they have no other choice. We also see that continuance commitment is negatively related to task performance. So as you're at your organization because you feel as though you have to be, task performance is going to decrease. So just because an employee is physically in the workplace doesn't mean they're actually performing to the best of their ability. So if we want to know whether or not an employee is going to have continuance commitment, we need to look at this factor called embeddedness. So there are actually 3 factors that go into embeddedness, and there's a great table in your textbook that gives some more examples of what embeddedness looks like. Keep in mind for each of these, embeddedness can occur for both workplace and non-workplace factors. So the first category of embeddedness is what we call links to the organization and the community. So when you think about links, you can think about responsibilities to the organization or different social links to the community. So with links, what we're really talking about is how rooted an individual is at work or in the community. So how many connections they have, how many projects they have. So an employee that would have a lot of links in the organization might be involved on multiple committees. Maybe they're involved in several new projects. These individuals might be part of a mentoring program, and they have a lot of mentees that they work with. So they have a lot of different connections or responsibilities in the workplace. When we're talking about links in the community, we can think about the number of connections a person has in the community. So do they have friends and family in the community? Do they have individuals that they know in the community that keep them kind of rooted in the area? The second component of embeddedness is called fit. So when you think about fit, you should think about a match between the organization and the employee. How good of a match is it? Or you can think about the match between the community and the employee. So how well does the organization and the community meet the needs of the employee? So when we're talking about fit, we're talking about this degree of fit or degree of match between the person's needs and what the organization and community provides. So with the organization, you might consider, what does an employee need? So maybe an employee needs some flexible working hours, and that works really well because they have children or other family responsibilities. Or maybe the organization allows this person to work remotely part of the time, which fits with the person's other lifestyle needs, right? So there's a match between what the person wants and what the organization provides. So if you're working at a job and you don't really necessarily love the organization, but it gives you flexibility or it allows you to work part-time from home, I mean, those are reasons why you might choose to stay with the organization, even if you don't necessarily feel an emotional connection to it. In terms of fit within the community, this again would be how much does the community fulfill the person's needs? So maybe someone wants to live in a city area and so they like their community because there's lots of walking trails and they're a really active person. Maybe they like the community because there's several stores that they enjoy shopping at, and it really fits their needs and values. Maybe this person has a child and the school system is really good and they want to keep their child enrolled in the school system. So this would be all the ways that the community fulfills the employee's needs, and that there's a match. As a result, someone might choose to stay in that community because it has the right school district, or because it has the outdoor recreation activities that someone wants. In this case, it would encourage someone to stay in their jobs so that they can stay within the community. The last component of embeddedness is called sacrifice, and this is basically what the employee would give up if they left their organization or if they had to leave the community. So if somebody has a 401k, maybe they'll lose some of their investment, or maybe they've got a really nice office and a great parking spot, and all of those benefits would be given up if they left the organization. So basically the sacrifice is what it is that keeps someone tethered to the organization, and the things that they stand to lose if they were to find a different job. So again, embeddedness has three components: links, fit, and sacrifice. And each of these are going to help keep an employee employed at their organization. It's going to increase commitment to the organization, where employees will find it hard to leave. As an example of this, in a prior job that I had, the organization found out that I really enjoyed running, and so when I was a new employee, they did their best to get me involved in running clubs and to show me different, places where you could go running, and really trying to increase this fit with the community, to show me how the community would align with my own values and needs in order to help increase my desire to stay in that area. Okay, the last type of commitment is called normative commitment. And normative commitment occurs when an employee stays with their organization because they feel as though it's the right thing to do. So this really encompasses a moral obligation to stay with the organization. You feel as though you ought to stay for some reason or another. Quite commonly, normative commitment occurs when an organization really values long-term loyalty. So if you've ever been in an organization where an employee is identified by the number of years they've worked at the organization on their name tag, that's a way of the company saying, look how long our employees stay. We really value having employees stay for long periods of time. And so that sense of longevity can kind of guilt employees into wanting to stay with the organization. Normative commitment can also occur when employees feel as though they owe the organization or must repay the organization for something. So for example, let's say that you wanted to go to graduate school and you were working with your current organization and they offered to pay some of the costs for graduate school. Once you completed your degree, you might feel as though you ought to stay or should stay with your organization because they help put you through schooling and it's the right thing to do to stay with them. Or perhaps your organization invested in you so that you could go to certain training programs or get a certain certification, and your organization's really invested in you, and now you feel like you need to repay them by staying employed at the organization. The research suggests that normative commitment does have a positive influence on those outcomes that we care about. So, when employees feel like staying at their organization is the moral thing to do or the right thing to do, it increases their citizenship behaviors. We also see this negative relation to turnover. So, as normative commitment increases, turnover intentions decrease. So, what you'll see here, really, if you followed along with the pattern, is that all three types of commitment reduce those turnover intentions. So, across all three types of commitment, employees are desiring to stay, right? But the reasons that they're staying are different. We also see a positive relationship between normative commitment and job performance. So when employees feel as though they owe the organization or as though staying is the right thing to do, we see an increase in their job performance. So if we want to predict normative commitment, the factor that we're going to hone in on is called indebtedness. And indebtedness really occurs in two ways. The first is this idea that employees are in the organization's debt. So again, when the organization has invested time, resources, training, when that happens, an employee is going to feel as though it's the right thing to do, or as though they're obligated to stay as a way to give back to the organization. The second component that can increase the sense of indebtedness is volunteering. So the research has shown that when employees are able to volunteer at organizations that they're passionate about, when employees are able to give volunteer time to causes that they care about, that actually increases the sense of moral commitment to their organization. So, for example, there are some companies. One of them, when I lived in the Midwest, is called the Illinois Farm Bureau, and they actually would give each of their employees 2 days a year to go volunteer anywhere they wanted, and they still got paid, so they didn't have to show up to work that day. Instead, they went to wherever they wanted to volunteer, and they were able to give back their time. So these employees are able to do good because the organization is supporting them in doing that. As a result, they feel as though they have this moral obligation to stay with their organization. So with normative commitment, we can invest in our employees, we can give them time and resources to help them become better employees by really investing in them, by giving them chances to volunteer and really live their values. They're going to feel this sense of normative commitment, which is going to increase their commitment and their tenure at our organizations. So again, just to recap, there are 3 types of commitment. In each instance, employees are saying that they're staying with their organization, but the reasons that they choose to stay are different. Okay, so this is the end of our short lecture. Go back and complete the rest of the module. Be sure to review Chapter 3 in the textbook. There are some really great examples of some of these concepts. And if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to send me an email or to visit office hours. I'd love to answer your questions. Okay, everyone, have a great week, and I look forward to being in touch with you. Take care.